This week's Bible study is on Psalm 130. Please read through the psalm before you watch this video. The first thing I read about this psalm in preparation said this: "This well-known and beloved psalm has been read mostly through the Pauline Lutheran notion of the wretchedness of the human condition." And this made me smile. Yes, I thought, I do know a fair number of Christians who dwell rather a lot on human wretchedness and seem to quite enjoy it. Personally, I'm not one of those who thinks that being human is a story of utter wickedness, or that the flesh is something to be feared, suppressed, or treated as an inconvenient fact of life. And so I was glad to read the second line of the commentary. Indeed, the human condition of iniquity is present in verses 3 and 8. The intention of the psalm, however, is not to comment on that wretchedness, but to speak about and to enact a transformation that liberates those in the depths into new freedom. In other words, I think Brueggemann, the commentator, is saying that although there are some who may read this psalm and use it as justification to dwell on our sinfulness and unworthiness, it is actually a passionate and poetic reminder of God's loving faithfulness, which sets us free and transforms us. We can choose to set our focus on the human part, or we can choose to set our focus on the God part, both of which are present here. Well, I know which is the one that I want to draw my attention, the one that offers hope and joy and forgiveness and new life. The passion of the psalmist is evident right from the start. This is a cry from the bottom of the heart, in a situation of deep need and powerlessness. It comes out of the depths, from a deep valley in which it is hardly possible to muster a prayer at all. The important thing to notice here is that we are listening to a faithful Israelite, not a silent one. Even in a dire situation, a place of immense need, the Israelite still speaks to God, still names God as Lord, still gives voice to a petition, still insists on God taking notice, still expresses his need, and still hopes. The actual petition is not made specific apart from the fact that the psalmist wants to be heard by God, and the wanting to be heard is important. To return to Brueggemann, Israel knows that the conversation with God itself is a saving, liberating transaction. Israel wants to be heard, for being heard means being honoured, taken seriously, and thereby empowered. In conventional analysis, verses 3 and 4 have been understood as the core request, a prayer for forgiveness. If we read it this way, then the focus on the wretchedness of humanity is a logical consequence. Brueggemann was very helpful again with regard to this. He takes the prayer of verses 1 and 2 to be the central petition, the cry for help in the depths of trouble. And he understands verses 3 and 4 to be subordinate to this. This seems to me to make sense, as in these verses the psalmist acknowledges sinfulness but doesn't actually ask for forgiveness. So it seems that the psalmist might be using this point to reinforce the cry for help at the beginning. The psalmist is saying, "Look, God, I know I've done wrong and you should have no reason to help me. But I know and trust that your forgiveness will override all that." So he doesn't actually ask for forgiveness, but he assumes that it's there for him all the same, and the psalm is built on this premise. The speaker doesn't grovel in guilt, but he accepts as a reason for making his petition the fact that forgiveness is already granted even before he brings his petition to God. He takes God very seriously, on the basis of a life that has long been pardoned. So this is not a wallowy, guilty prayer, but it's the prayer of a forgiven, untroubled person who is able to leave his shortcomings freely in the hands of God. The tone is of joy and liberation. The speaker is genuinely free. There is no doubt of his standing with God. The psalmist then looks forward with great expectation, watching to see what God will do, and confident that God's promises are reliable. He doesn't doubt that God will bring goodness and well-being to him. The liberated expectation continues in verses 5 and 6 as the words wait and hope, which form a triad here, in Hebrew are synonyms. There is eager anticipation of God's loving, liberating, powerful action to come, and the triple hopeful waiting is reinforced by the double use of the verb watch, which refers to the night watchman or sentry who stands alertly on guard. The watching of a sentry can be defensive, but can also be an anticipation, like waiting for a message or waiting for the arrival of supplies. This prayer is in waiting for God's future activity, which is eagerly anticipated and welcomed. It's only when we get to verses 7 and 8 that we get any substance to the prayer of verses 1 and 2, and the hope of verses 5 and 6. The verb hope picks up on verse 5, but here we learn what the hope is all about. The reality is the expectation that God's hesed, God's steadfast love, loyalty and faithfulness will now act on behalf of Israel. The depths have been the places where the psalmist felt that God's faithful love had been absent, but now Israel hopes for what it doesn't feel, because it fully trusts in the faithfulness of God. What that hope is comes to light at the end of verse 7 and in verse 8. It's expressed in the word redeem. In the final verse, this is reduced to the problem of sin, but actually it carries with it all the liberating possibility of God's activity in any place where we feel powerless. Israel is redeemed from slavery, from sin, but individuals are also liberated from loneliness, sickness, prison and other circumstances, as well as from sin. So this psalm contains the whole drama of the gospel of Jesus. The speaker is in the depths, but the waiting on God and the reliance on God's hesed, God's loving faithfulness, anticipates a whole new life of freedom, dignity, value and well-being. The memory of God's faithful acts in the past makes it possible to be confident in the present, even in the midst of terrible circumstances. You might want to think about this psalm a bit more, so here are some questions you might like to consider. Read through the psalm again slowly 2 or 3 times. Take note of any words or phrases that stand out for you. What do you think is the tone of the psalm on closer reading? Does this surprise you at all? Does this differ from the way you may have read it before? How do you respond to Brueggemann's suggestion that here forgiveness is not asked for, but it is assumed that it is already given? In what ways might this affect the way you approach confession to God? Think of a time when you have felt yourself to be in the depths and have cried out to God. Have you been able to share the psalmist's confidence, or have you found it difficult? How do you respond to the idea that the memory of God's activity in the past gives ground for confidence in the present? Think of a time when you have felt the closeness of God or seen God at work in your life in the past. Perhaps write it on a postcard and keep it inside your Bible, so that when you feel you are in the depths, you can bring it out and remember. Spend some time in quietness, reflecting on your own situation, or bringing to God any people you know who are facing difficult times right now.